The golden age of Hollywood, a time of glamour, magic, and dreams manufactured under bright studio lights. From the 1930s through the 1960s, the film industry created a mythology so powerful that it reshaped American culture itself. Movie stars weren't merely entertainers. They were gods and goddesses, immortalized on massive screens, defining beauty, morality, and heroism for generations. The public devoured their images, collected their photographs, and shaped their lives around the personas these actors presented on screen. But what happens when we look behind the curtain? What emerges when we examine the lives of those who created this golden mythology, stripped of the makeup, the lighting, and the carefully crafted public relations? According to filmmaker Ron Howard, who has spent decades studying Hollywood's history and its legends, the reality is far darker than the mythology would have us believe. In recent reflections on cinema history, Howard has spoken candidly about the gap between the heroes audiences loved and the men and women who played them. Hollywood, Howard once observed, has always been a place where image supersedes truth, where a charming smile can excuse almost anything, and where power without conscience goes unchecked for decades. We built an industry on the dreams of these performers, but many of those performers were, by any reasonable measure, terrible human beings. This script explores six figures from Hollywood's golden age whose personal conduct contradicted their public personas. These are not mere gossip or speculation, but documented cases where the private behavior of celebrated actors revealed character flaws ranging from cruelty to exploitation. Their stories offer insight into how institutions protect powerful individuals and how public adoration can serve as a shield against accountability. Errol Flynn arrived in Hollywood like a comet, burning bright and fast across the cinematic sky. Born in 1909 in Tasmania, Flynn embodied a particular kind of masculine fantasy that resonated throughout the 1930s and 1940s. With his chiseled features, athletic build, and magnetic screen presence, he was the perfect leading man for swashbuckling adventures. Films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood made him an international sensation before he was 30 years old. On screen, Flynn represented a kind of romantic idealism, the dashing hero who fought for justice, rescued damsels, and won hearts through charm and courage. Off-screen, however, a different picture emerged. Flynn was known for his excessive lifestyle, constant partying, heavy drinking, and a seeming obsession with seduction. Studio executives overlooked these behaviors because Flynn remained box office gold, and the publicity machinery worked overtime to maintain his heroic image. The facade cracked in 1942 when two teenage girls, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen, accused Flynn of statutory rape. The trial became a media sensation, dominating newspapers across America. Rather than showing remorse or concern, Flynn reportedly laughed during testimony and treated the proceedings as entertainment. He was ultimately acquitted, but the trial revealed the extent to which the studio system would go to protect its investments. Warner Brothers hired the best lawyers money could buy, and there were suggestions that witnesses were persuaded to disappear or change their stories. After the trial, Flynn's behavior only intensified. Letters discovered years later showed him bragging about his conquests and displaying contempt for the women involved. He seemed to believe that his fame made him untouchable, that the rules governing ordinary men simply did not apply to him. In many ways, he was right. Hollywood machinery protected him, and the public largely forgave him or forgot the trial entirely. Flynn's final years were marked by rapid decline. Alcohol and drug abuse ravaged his body. By 1959, at only 50 years old, his heart simply gave out. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but those who knew him understood that years of excess and the psychological weight of his own cruelty had contributed to his early demise. He died as he had lived, taking without giving, charming while destroying, protected by an industry that valued his image above his victims' welfare. Few figures in cinema history loomed as large as John Wayne. Born Marion Morrison in Iowa, Wayne transformed himself into an American institution. By the 1950s, he was more than an actor. He was a symbol of the West, of American masculinity, of patriotic virtue. He played soldiers and cowboys with such conviction that the line between performer and person blurred in the public imagination. But Wayne's off-screen persona was considerably darker than his on-screen heroics. He ruled film sets with intimidation and fear. Crew members who failed to meet his exacting standards faced public humiliation and verbal abuse. He was known for treating those he considered beneath him, assistant directors, grips, gaffers, with contempt. Those who worked with him repeatedly described an atmosphere of tension and anxiety, a workplace where one misstep could result in explosive anger. Beyond the sets, Wayne held views that contradicted the humanitarian values many of his films seemed to promote. His 1971 Playboy interview stands as one of the most revealing documents of the era. In it, Wayne expressed views that ranged from culturally insensitive to openly racist. He questioned whether Native Americans were entitled to the land they inhabited, suggested that Black Americans were unprepared for self-governance, and dismissed progressive social movements as weakness masquerading as progress. What made these statements particularly troubling was Wayne's influence. He wasn't simply an actor. He was a cultural icon whose views carried weight. Young people who admired him on screen absorbed his ideologies. Conservative politicians cited him as a moral authority. He became synonymous with a particular vision of America, one that was exclusionary, hierarchical, and resistant to change. On film sets, Wayne's personality frequently interfered with his craft. When working on The Searchers with director John Ford, Wayne clashed repeatedly over his character's portrayal. His character was a racist, vengeful man, but Wayne wanted to play him sympathetically. The final film became a fascinating artifact, the character's racism visible in the script and plot, but Wayne's own discomfort with the role bleeding through his performance. Even in his final years, as cancer consumed his body, Wayne refused to apologize or reconsider his worldview. He blamed critics as weak and blamed society for changing around him rather than examining his own role in perpetuating harmful ideologies. When he died in 1979, much of America mourned a hero. But for many filmmakers and artists who came after, Wayne's legacy served as a cautionary tale about the danger of conflating on-screen heroism with off-screen virtue. Faye Dunaway possessed undeniable talent. Her performances in Bonnie and Clyde and Chinatown demonstrated an intelligence and intensity that marked her as one of the finest actresses of her generation. She brought psychological complexity to her roles, a willingness to explore morally ambiguous characters with depth and nuance. Her career should have been one of sustained excellence and critical acclaim. Instead, Dunaway became known throughout the industry for behavior that undermined her relationships with directors, cinematographers, and crew members. The stories accumulated: tantrums on set, impossible demands, treatment of junior staff members as disposable. Unlike some problematic actors whose cruelty stemmed from insecurity or substance abuse, Dunaway's behavior appeared to stem from a different source: a fundamental belief in her own superiority and a willingness to use power to enforce that hierarchy. During the filming of Mommy Dearest, the irony was particularly sharp. Dunaway played Joan Crawford, a woman infamous for cruelty and abuse toward those around her. Yet Dunaway reportedly exhibited many of the same behaviors her character displayed on screen. Director Frank Perry later revealed that he seriously considered abandoning the project because of Dunaway's verbal abuse and volatile temperament. She threw objects, screamed at makeup artists, and refused to work until lighting and camera angles satisfied her exacting standards. These weren't isolated incidents. On multiple films, similar stories emerged. On The Wicked Lady, she allegedly slapped a cameraman and spat on a crew member. On Don Juan de Marco, she humiliated production assistants to such a degree that filming halted for an entire day. Her former manager characterized her as someone who didn't simply play divas but became them, that the boundary between performance and reality had dissolved entirely. What distinguished Dunaway's behavior from that of other difficult actors was its consistency and its apparent lack of consequence. While some actors mellowed with age or faced industry consequences, Dunaway seemed to escalate. By the 2000s, directors and studios stopped calling her, not out of vindictiveness, but out of practical necessity. She had become unmanageable, and the cost of working with her outweighed the benefits of her talent. Her final public appearances only cemented this reputation. When fired from a Broadway revival of Tea at 5, she blamed everyone but herself. She gave interviews in which she claimed to be a victim of industry sexism and ageism, seemingly unable or unwilling to acknowledge her own role in her isolation. For many observers, Dunaway represented a cautionary tale, that talent without empathy eventually turns toxic, that brilliance unchecked by compassion ultimately destroys itself. Kirk Douglas clawed his way up from poverty to become one of Hollywood's most respected actors. Born Iza Danielovich to immigrant parents, he embodied a particular American narrative, the poor boy who works his way to the top through sheer determination and talent. His performance in Spartacus defined an era and made him a global icon. On screen, Douglas conveyed intensity, intelligence, and a kind of righteous anger that made him perfect for roles examining power and injustice. The disconnect between his screen persona and his actual character was profound. Those who worked with Douglas described a man of volcanic temperament, someone whose rage could erupt without warning or apparent provocation. Crew members reported being verbally assaulted for minor mistakes. Fellow performers spoke of his need to dominate not just scenes but everyone in them. Actress Deborah Paddett, who worked with him, noted that Douglas's goal seemed to be not simply to deliver a good performance, but to establish his superiority over everyone else on set. Howard, studying Douglas's films as a young filmmaker, detected something troubling in his performances. There's a kind of rage under that smile, Howard once reflected, the kind that eats a person alive. This rage wasn't directed at his character's enemies. It seemed directed at everyone around him, channeled through his roles but not contained by them. The most serious allegations against Douglas involve his behavior toward women. While Douglas was never charged with any crime, multiple sources have pointed to his involvement in alleged incidents that would constitute serious violations today. These allegations, often circulated in Hollywood gossip but rarely discussed publicly, suggest a man who used his power and position to coerce and manipulate women who couldn't easily resist or report him. Even decades after his peak career, Douglas remained a controversial figure. When he accepted an honorary Oscar in 1996, many in the industry saw a man seeking redemption and peace. For others, including filmmakers like Howard, it represented the final act of an incredibly skilled performer who had spent his entire career running from his own demons. The applause that greeted him seemed less like genuine appreciation and more like a collective agreement to pretend that his talent had somehow absolved him of responsibility for his actions. Roman Polanski represents perhaps the most morally complex figure in this examination. His films demonstrated genuine artistic brilliance. Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby marked him as a visionary filmmaker, someone working at the highest levels of cinematic art. His life, marked by Nazi occupation and personal tragedy, his pregnant wife murdered by the Manson family, seemed to justify his increasingly dark worldview. But brilliance and trauma do not excuse predation. In 1977, at 43 years old and at the height of his creative powers, Polanski was arrested for the sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl. The evidence was overwhelming. He pleaded guilty to unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor, then fled the country before sentencing, escaping to France where he remained beyond the reach of American law. What made this case particularly revealing about Hollywood's moral bankruptcy was the industry's response. Some condemned him outright, but others defended him as a tortured artist, as if his creative achievements somehow mitigated his crime. Directors and actors who had celebrated him continued to work with him. Critics continued to praise his films. The industry essentially agreed to separate the artist from the crime, to evaluate his work independently of his actions. Decades later, when Polanski won an Oscar for The Pianist in 2003, the moment encapsulated everything problematic about Hollywood's priorities. The audience rose to applaud a man who had raped a child and fled justice. The moment seemed surreal and, to many observers, obscene. Even more disturbing was that the industry seemed to have largely moved past the scandal, treating it as an unfortunate historical artifact rather than an ongoing moral stain. For filmmakers coming of age during this period, Polanski's continued career and celebrated status sent a clear message: that artistic achievement could serve as a shield against accountability, that the right connections and enough time could rehabilitate almost any reputation. It was a lesson that poisoned an entire generation's understanding of artistic ethics. Mickey Rooney presents a different kind of darkness, not predatory like Polanski, not tyrannical like Wayne, but deeply, personally destructive. Born Joseph Ewell Jr. in 1920, Rooney became Hollywood's first true child superstar. By 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America. MGM built an empire on his grin, his dancing, his infectious charm. He represented innocence, joy, and the optimistic American spirit. The reality of his private life couldn't have been more different. Rooney married 8 times, cheated constantly, gambled away millions, and treated people around him with a kind of careless cruelty that suggested he believed normal rules of human decency simply didn't apply to him. His ex-wife Ava Gardner famously called him the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. What distinguished Rooney's behavior was its emotional component. He didn't simply exploit or abuse people. He emotionally manipulated them. Those who worked with him reported whiplash emotional states. He could be charming and generous one moment, then viciously cruel the next. The instability made working with him exhausting and damaging. Judy Garland, his closest friend during their MGM years, hinted in later interviews that Rooney bore some responsibility for her psychological deterioration, that his volatility and